After 5 days of hiking, I was starting to feel tired, but the weather was perfect, and when the sun shines in the Scottish Highlands, you go up mountains. So, the day after walking out of Fisherfield, I found myself heading out with 2 regular clients, Ian and Jesus, up another peak in Torridon. Our plan was to camp overnight on Ben Eaglisher, a peak with high lochans, which I hoped might provide some photographic potential. After walking up through a small woodland of Scots pine, we reached a place where, 2 years before, I'd proposed to my wife, and after reminding myself of that special moment, we crossed the river and headed up into the mountains.
While camping in the age of coronavirus.
This is the first composition that I'm focusing on, and I'm starting here because the sun is about to dip behind a little bit of high ground just behind the camera. So I want to get this shot before the light goes, and I actually really like this landscape. It's fairly unusual up here to find these sort of quarry-like structures. This is all Torridonian sandstone, which is obviously typical of Torridon. But it's still unusual to see the rocks quite like this, and of course these lovely pools really help to break that rock up, and then we've got these fantastic prominent mountains behind and the sky to cap it off. So this really has everything going for it, and although the light isn't that perfect warm soft light, I actually think the fairly colour neutral quality of the light works pretty well with showing off this landscape in an illustrative way, so showing the natural colours that are present in the scene rather than any warming colours that the sun might bring to it. Before I show you the finished image, I thought I'd just very quickly talk you through my thought process. So I was just walking up the hill over there and looked down at these pools, and I immediately thought, well, if I walk behind the pools, I'll obviously be able to get them in front of the mountains behind. So then I started walking along this edge here, and obviously I could take a photo from this spot. I'd probably have to do something to clone out my shadow that you can see over there on the rock on the left, but this would work perfectly well, and it's maybe a simpler way to shoot it. And in fact, if you zoom in here, you can find a nice simple version that just has a water and rock. But I wanted to add an additional element for 2 reasons. One, just to increase that sense of the sort of quarried rock almost, even though no quarrying has happened here. But also to resolve the bottom edge, because you can see there's some rocks sort of creeping in there. So it's a little bit difficult to get the kind of framing that I actually wanted. So including some foreground rocks does serve 2 purposes, and so I just started to move back and then look for interesting rock structures. And you can see this section of rock here has some nice crisscrossing patterns and some pretty grasses. So nothing fancy, but a nice foreground to incorporate into the scene. So then if I move the camera back to where my tripod is, roughly there, then you can see that I'm just bringing that rock up to the water level, but not going so low that the separation between those pools gets lost. So that's how I'm setting my vertical height, if you like. So it's a simple composition, but there's just a bit of thought going into camera positioning just to make sure that the water and rock are the right place within the frame. And again, as you move right, you can see that foreground rock move to the left. So that's another thing that I was thinking of when I framed my final shot.
I think I'm fairly happy with how this image has come out. It's got a graphic quality to it that I think comes from those two pyramidal peaks and the interlocking pattern of water and rock that I was so drawn to photographing in the first place. And I've cropped to 4x5 partly to enhance those graphic qualities, but also to solve some of the problems I was having around the edges of the frame, as well as making sure that that foreground spreads across the width of the frame. The clouds have worked out pretty well. The timing for this shot turned out to be pretty good. I did take some of the life out of the blues in the sky there. They were just starting to get a bit electric, but otherwise the edit is nice and simple, and I'm pretty pleased with this.
That's one shot done, and the water is just calming down, as you can see, so starting to get some really nice reflections going. But if I look towards the sun, then unfortunately there is, I think, a band of cirrus beneath that cloud that you see there. So it may be that we just lose the light at the last minute, which is really disappointing. Kind of racing now to see if I can catch the last of the light, because it is still on the mountains and the wind's dropped off. So I'm wondering if I can get down to this pool quick enough to see a reflection. So that light is just starting to drop off, but unfortunately this larger pool here isn't quite as still as those ones back there, and I think it will actually become almost mirror-like as the wind changes direction overnight. So maybe there's going to be a moonlight or twilight shot there, and I think I'm going to head up here to get a view down over this lochen a bit more, so that I can look more across to these hills. So in other words, moving up and to the right to reposition that lochen relative to the view that you see here. So there's Jesus out exploring a different point of this lochen. I've just moved a little bit further on, so you can see that now I can include those mountains on the left a little bit better. The mountain on the right, if I include it, I need to leave space on the left equal to the space on the right. I think that does kind of work, but maybe the tighter shot is better. So framing something like that, I think that's a bit cleaner. And maybe I actually want to put the edge of the frame here to leave that mountain on the right out completely. But if I do that, you can see that the lochen at the bottom is too close to the right edge of the frame. So the answer is I need to move up further to the right still. And of course, that'll have the benefit of including these mountains on the left even more into the frame. So I think that composition behind me is pretty close to what I want now. Obviously the mountain on the right hand side of the frame is perhaps a tiny bit dominant, but I think it works nicely with those smaller hills off to the left. And it's really nice to have that pool starting to calm down and providing some reflections of those clouds. I'm crossing my fingers that that's going to get even better, but it's all going to depend on the light, because actually the light isn't that great at the moment. The sun is popping in and out of cloud, and it does look like it's going to drift into some cirrus. So I'll just cross my fingers and see what happens now. I'm going to have a wander and see if I can find a foreground maybe to include into this composition, just to bring in an extra element. This is about the best I can find as far as foregrounds go, but I'm not sure that it's really adding to the view behind, which is far more impressive than that foreground. I like these shapes on the left, these sort of slab-like structures, but it's just the way that in this area here it sort of starts to break down a bit. It just makes it a bit of a messy foreground, so you get the impression that this is one big shape instead of a continuous foreground, which is kind of what I was looking for. So it might be that I abandon that idea of finding a foreground.
So this was the image that I came away with from that sunset. So it was taken just before that last video clip I showed you when there was still a bit of sunlight out. And I think the fact that a lot of the sunlight is blocked by cloud is actually favourable. If you imagine that mountain on the right being bright orange lit by the sun, I think it would have become too much for the image as a whole. And the light on the mountains on the left is really quite beautiful. There's some nice structure coming into the mountains. But I think that's about where the positives end for me with this image. It's a bit too linear. There's a lot of horizontal lines going on, particularly with the foreground and also in the sky, which I think is quite distracting. There's quite a lot of contrast in that sky, despite my attempts to fix that in post-processing. And yeah, I think it maybe just feels a bit too obvious compositionally as well. This big pool in the base of the frame maybe seems a bit too straightforward. So not one for the portfolio this, but maybe in some different conditions, maybe coming back in winter, it could be really exciting. And that was game over, unfortunately, for our shoot, because the sun dropped into that cloud bank and everything became very flat and grey. And of course, I was hopeful that blue hour might provide something interesting, but because the light was behind us, the scene that you could see here, which was the main direction we were shooting in, was just very, very flat. And of course, it became increasingly blue, but that doesn't necessarily make for a good photograph. I was hoping for some more sculpting light. So I was actually pretty happy to head back to the tents and have a hot chocolate and then go to bed. And we woke up the following morning and it was cloudy, so we just walked straight back out again, knowing that we had a full week of hiking ahead of us. And in the next video, you're going to see one of the best shooting opportunities I've had this year. We really did have some fantastic luck, so do keep an eye open for that one. And if you've enjoyed this video, then please do consider subscribing to the channel.